Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Night Fright. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. My hometown is Anchorage, Alaska, a place where the winters are long, dark, and biting cold. When I was around 12 years old, I found myself in a difficult position. I wasn't doing well in regular school, struggling with my grades and the general structure of the education system. As a result, I was sent to a secondary type of school, which was essentially a last-ditch effort for children who were failing to make the grade. It was a place for kids who were seen as heading down the wrong path. And at that age, I felt the weight of that label every single day. To get to this school, I had to endure a grueling commute that started while most of the city was still fast asleep. Living in the Mountain View area, I had to get up super early in the pitch-black Alaskan mornings to catch a city bus. My journey involved taking one bus from Mountain View to a neighborhood called Mulun. Once I arrived in Mulun, I had to wait for a transfer to the North Lights Boulevard bus. The transfer point was the centerpiece of my morning routine, and it was located right in front of a nice little bakery, in a city where the wind can cut through you like a knife. That bakery was a beacon of warmth and light. Whenever I had a couple of dollars in my pocket, which was quite frequent, maybe 3 to 5 days a week, I would step inside to escape the freezing air. The smell inside was always incredible. A mix of fresh yeast, sugary glaze, and strong hot coffee. I would buy a donut and a cup of coffee to keep my hands warm. The baker was always there, working away in the back or standing behind the counter. He was an older man, tall and slender, with those distinct 1960s style glasses that were popular back then. From the very first time I walked in, he was incredibly lovely and polite to me. He seemed to recognize that I was just a young girl out on her own in the early hours. And he treated me with a kindness that I didn't often experience elsewhere on mornings when it was particularly cold or the weather was especially nasty. He wouldn't make me wait outside at the bus stop. Instead, he would gesture for me to stay inside where it was warm. He would sit me down and often give me free refills on my coffee, never asking for extra money. What struck me most was how much he seemed to care about my life. He would ask me about my family, how my day was going, and how I was faring at my new school. As a young girl who felt like she was failing at life, having an adult who seemed genuinely interested in my well-being was a huge deal. He spoke to me with a soft, caring tone and always made sure I felt safe before I headed out to catch my next bus. He knew I was traveling alone across a large, sometimes dangerous city, and he acted almost like a guardian. Later that year, in 1981, my life took a major turn when my family moved away from the icy landscape of Alaska to the tropical warmth of Hawaii. The bakery, the kind older man, and those dark mornings in Mulun became distant memories as I adjusted to my new life in the islands. I stopped thinking about the long bus rides and the last-ditch school, focusing instead on the sunshine and a fresh start. However, those memories came rushing back in a terrifying way. Just a couple of years later, it was October of 1983 when the news broke, and it sent shock waves through everyone who had ever lived in Anchorage. That nice, lovely baker who had been so kind to me, the man who had given me free coffee and watched over me while I waited for the bus, was arrested. His name was Robert Hansen, and he was being held as a suspected serial killer. I remember seeing his face on the news and feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with the Alaskan weather. The man in the 60s. Style glasses, the polite baker who seemed so genuinely interested in my life, was a monster. The realization that I had spent dozens of hours alone with a man who was capable of such unspeakable violence was almost too much to process. I realized then that I had been extremely lucky, but I also understood why I had survived. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Robert Hansen had a very specific type. He didn't just target anyone. He looked for women who were vulnerable in a different way than I was. His favorite choices were drug-addicted women and prostitutes, particularly those who worked the streets around 4th Avenue. He chose them because he believed quite cynically that most people wouldn't notice if they went missing, and that the authorities wouldn't look for them with much urgency. He was a predator who preyed on the marginalized people he thought the world had forgotten. I was a 12-year-old girl struggling with school, but I wasn't part of the world he hunted in. To him, I was just a customer, a child he could play the role of the kind baker for, perhaps as a way to mask the darkness that lived inside him. The details of his crimes were horrific. He was eventually linked to at least 17 known victims, though many believe the actual number was much higher. He would kidnap these women, take them out into the vast, uninhabited Alaskan wilderness in his small private plane, and then release them so he could hunt them like animals. One of his most famous victims was known for years only as Eklutna Annie, a young woman whose body was found in a shallow grave near a remote road. The cruelty and calculation required to carry out such acts were a stark contrast to the man who had let me sit in his warm bakery on snowy mornings. The story hit even closer to home within my own family. My mother-in-law has always been convinced that her sister was one of Robert Hansen's victims. Her sister had disappeared in the late 70s and was never seen again. She had been a prostitute working on 4th Avenue, exactly the profile that Hansen targeted. Despite years of searching and hopping for answers, she was never found. Given everything that came to light during the trial and the subsequent investigations, my mother-in-law is almost certainly right. Her sister likely met her end at the hands of the same man who used to pour my coffee and ask me about my homework. Reflecting on those days in Anchorage is a strange and unsettling experience. I think about the times I sat at that small table in the bakery, feeling grateful for the warmth and the conversation. I think about how he looked at me through those glasses and wondered what he was really thinking. Was he truly being kind to a child? Or was he just perfecting his disguise as a normal, helpful member of the community? It is a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't always look like a villain in a movie. Sometimes it looks like a polite, older man who runs a neighborhood bakery and makes sure a young girl gets her bus on time. The city of Anchorage changed. After his arrest, the sense of security that people felt in their local shops and neighborhoods was shaken. For me, the story is a permanent part of my history. A narrow escape from a shadow I didn't even know was there. It taught me that you truly never know who is standing on the other side of a counter or what secrets are hidden behind a friendly smile. I look back at my younger self, that 12-year-old girl on her way to a last-ditch school, and I realize that despite my struggles at the time, I was being watched over by something much more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I survived that period of my life and went on to find my way. But the memory of the baker in Mulun remains a haunting presence. It serves as a stark lesson about the complexity of human nature and the thin line between safety and danger. The wilderness of Alaska is vast and beautiful, but its true darkness wasn't found in the woods or the mountains. It was found in the heart of a man who served donuts and coffee in the early morning light. Every time I hear a story about a nice guy who turned out to be something else, I am transported back to that bakery, the smell of fresh bread, and the man with the 60s glasses who almost made me part of a much darker story. When I was really little, so young that I was still sleeping in a crib, something happened that I would not fully understand until many years later. At the time, it was just another night to me. I was asleep, unaware of the fear that suddenly filled our house. But for my parents, especially my mother, that night never truly left them. It was late, and the house was quiet in the way it usually is when everyone is asleep. My parents were in their bedroom when they heard a strange sound coming from my room. It was not a normal noise. Not the kind you could easily explain away as the wind or an animal. It was a harsh, unnatural rattling sound, like something being shaken or scraped repeatedly. The noise was coming from my window, specifically from the security screen that was meant to protect our home. My parents immediately knew. Something was wrong. My dad got out of bed without hesitation. He did not stop to question what it might be or hope that it would go away. He moved quickly down the hallway toward my room, his heart racing, already preparing himself for the worst. My mother stayed behind, frozen in fear, listening closely and praying that whatever was happening would end without anyone getting hurt. When my dad reached my room, he could see a dark shape through the window. A man's silhouette was visible on the other side of the glass, partially blocked by the blinds. The figure was close, far too close, and the sound of the rattling made sense now. Someone was at my window, actively trying to tamper with it. Without thinking too much about his own safety, my dad went straight to the window and yanked the blinds open. The sudden movement and light were meant to scare the person away, and they worked. The man outside froze for a moment, long enough for my dad to recognize him. It was someone from the neighborhood, a man named Nigel Perro. As soon as he realized he had been seen, Nigel ran. He fled the scene quickly, disappearing into the darkness, before my dad could do anything else. By the time my mother came rushing into the room, shaken and terrified, the man was gone. I was still asleep in my crib, completely unaware of how close I had come to something truly horrifying. That night stayed with my parents. They locked everything more tightly than before and became extra cautious, especially when it came to me. But life has a way of moving forward, even when fear lingers in the background. As the years passed, that moment slowly faded into something they rarely spoke about, at least not to me. A few years later, something happened that brought Nigel Parr's name back into our lives in a far more public and violent way. By then, I was older, around 7 years old, and more aware of what was happening around me, though still too young to fully grasp the seriousness of it all. One day, our neighborhood was suddenly filled with police activity. There were sirens, flashing lights, and a sense of panic that spread quickly from house to house. Word traveled fast, especially in a place where everyone seemed to know each other. Nigel Perro had been involved in a serious incident with the police. After a dispute in the neighborhood, he had opened fire on police officers. 3 officers were shot during the encounter. 2 of them were shot at point-blank range, and another officer was shot multiple times in the face, somewhere between 5 and 8 times. That officer survived, but his injuries were severe. He was left permanently disfigured. His life forever changed by that violent moment. The shock of what Nigel had done was overwhelming. People were scared, confused, and angry. The manhunt began almost immediately. Police searched everywhere, combing through nearby areas, knocking on doors, and setting up roadblocks. For days, then weeks, Nigel was nowhere to be found. It felt like he had vanished into thin air. I remember the tension during that time. Even as a child, I could feel it in the air. Adults whispered in low voices. Television stayed on with the news playing constantly, and parents kept their children closer than usual. There was a fear that lingered. The unsettling thought that a dangerous man was still out there hiding somewhere close. After 20 days, the search came to an end. Nigel Perro was found in a local bushland area not far from where we lived. He had taken his own life, shooting himself in the head. The manhunt was over, but the sense of relief was mixed with sadness, confusion, and a deep sense of unease. At the time, I knew he had died, and I knew he was the same man who had shot the police officers. But I did not know the full story. I did not know about the night at my window. That part was kept from me, perhaps to protect me, or perhaps because my parents themselves struggled to process it. It was not until I was older that my mother finally told me the truth. She sat me down and explained what had happened when I was a baby, how they had heard that terrible rattling sound, how my dad had rushed to my room, and how Nigel Perrod had been standing outside my window trying to get in. Hearing that changed the way I looked at my own childhood. It was unsettling to realize that something so dark had come so close to me before I could even remember it. It made me think about how fragile life really is, and how much can happen without us ever knowing. My mother spoke about it calmly, but I could tell it still affected her deeply. She said it was a sad story for everyone involved, not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood and even for Nigel himself. Despite everything he had done, she did not speak of him with pure hatred. Instead, there was a complicated mix of fear, sorrow, and understanding. Nigel had been a familiar face in our neighborhood for many years. People knew him, and over time they noticed that something was not right. He became increasingly disturbed, more unpredictable, and more isolated. He would harass people in the area, making them uncomfortable and uneasy. My mother herself had a prior run-in with him, an incident that left her shaken and wary of him long before the night at my window. That earlier encounter was the reason my parents were able to recognize him so quickly when he was outside my room. They knew his face, his build, and the way he moved. It made the situation even more terrifying, knowing that this was not a stranger, but someone who had been around for years. In the time leading up to the shooting, Nigel's behavior reportedly became worse. He grew more paranoid, more withdrawn, and more disconnected from reality. He isolated himself, cutting off whatever support or normally he might have once had. People in the neighborhood sensed that something was wrong, but no one truly understood how bad it had become. After his death, more details about his life came to light. It was revealed that he had been sexually abused by a school teacher when he was younger. This revelation shocked many people and added another layer of complexity to the story. Some believed that this trauma may have been the catalyst for his paranoia and mental deterioration later in life. Knowing that does not excuse what he did. The harm he caused was real and devastating. Police officers were nearly killed. One was permanently disfigured, and countless people were traumatized by his actions. My family, especially my parents, carried the weight of knowing how close he had come to harming me when I was completely defenseless. But understanding his past does make the story more tragic. It shows how untreated trauma and mental illness can spiral into something truly destructive. My mother often said that if things had been different, if he had received help when he needed it, perhaps none of this would have happened. As I grew older, I found myself thinking about that night more often. I imagined my dad standing in the dark, pulling open the blinds, coming face to face with someone who meant harm. I imagined my mother waiting in the hallway, terrified of what she might hear next. I imagined how easily the outcome could have been different if my parents had not woken up, if my dad had hesitated for even a second. That thought has stayed with me. It made me appreciate my parents in a way I did not before. Their instinct to protect me, their quick reaction, and their courage in that moment likely saved my life. It also made me more aware of the hidden dangers that can exist even in places that seem safe and familiar. This story is not just about fear or violence. It is about how close darkness can come without us ever realizing it. It is about how trauma can shape a person's life in devastating ways, and how the consequences can ripple outward, affecting countless others. And it is about how sometimes we only learn the full truth of our past when we are old enough to face it. Even now, thinking back on it sends a chill through me. I was just a baby sleeping peacefully, unaware that someone was standing outside my window in the middle of the night. Unaware that my life, as I would come to know it, could have ended before it even truly began. My great-great-grandfather's brother had 3 kids, all girls, and his wife died during the birth of the last one. At the time, that kind of loss was tragically common, especially in rural parts of the American South. But that didn't make it any easier. He was left alone with 3 very young daughters trying to manage grief, parenthood, and the daily demands of farm life all at once. Family members helped where they could. Neighbors checked in from time to time, and slowly, painfully, life found a new rhythm. A few years passed, and as the girls grew older, it became clear that raising 3 children alone was taking a toll on him. He worked long days on his farm in South Carolina, a place that was considered nice and fairly prosperous for the time. The land was good, the crops were steady, and the house, while simple, was solid and comfortable. The girls were healthy, close with one another, and surrounded by extended family who lived nearby. Despite the loss of their mother, there was stability, routine, and a sense of belonging. Then one day he introduced a new woman as his wife. No one in the family knew where she came from. She hadn't grown up nearby. No one remembered meeting her before. There were no stories, no shared history, no familiar connections. From the start, something about her felt off. She was quiet in a way that didn't feel shy but closed. She avoided questions, brushed off curiosity, and kept herself distant from everyone else. Family gatherings became tense. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Over time, her presence began to isolate him and the girls from the rest of the family. People tried to warn him. They told him they didn't trust her. They said something wasn't right, but he had already lost one wife. And he wanted to believe that this second chance at companionship was real. He defended her. He asked everyone to give her time. And for a while, nothing openly terrible happened. They continued living on the farm. The girls went to school, helped with chores, and tried to adjust to having a stepmother they barely knew. She was strict, distant, and unpredictable. Some days she barely spoke to them. Other days she watched them with an intensity that made them uneasy. But again, nothing seemed bad enough to justify pulling them away or causing a public scandal. In those days, people endured a lot behind closed doors. Then came the first incident that should have ended everything. One morning, he woke up screaming in pain. His chest and stomach were burning. His new wife was standing over him, pouring battery acid onto his skin. The injuries were severe. He survived, but the damage was real and permanent. Family members were horrified when they heard what had happened. They begged him to leave her. They told him this wasn't an accident, wasn't confusion, wasn't forgivable. For reasons no one ever truly understood, he chose to forgive her. He told people it was a mistake. He said she didn't know what she was doing. He said she was sick, confused, or overwhelmed. He minimized the event, downplayed the danger, and insisted they move forward as a family. Against all advice, against all logic, he stayed. Life on the farm continued, but it was no longer peaceful. The girls became quieter. They spent more time together, whispering among themselves, clinging to one another for comfort. The house felt heavy. The air felt tense. Family visits became rare, partly because the wife discouraged them, and partly because everyone felt uncomfortable being there. Unknown to anyone at the time, something far darker was happening in the background. Over months, possibly years, the wife had been collecting newspaper and hay. Small amounts at first, nothing noticeable. She hid it under the house, shoving it into crawl spaces, piling it carefully where no one would think to look. To anyone watching, it would have seemed harmless, just farm supplies, just clutter. But she was preparing. One night, everything changed. The house was quiet. The girls were asleep. The wife woke them one by one. She told them they needed to go to the attic. Maybe she said it was a game. Maybe she said it was important. No one knows exactly what words she used, only what she did next. She tied them up. All 3 girls were bound and surrounded by hay and newspaper, dry, flammable, carefully arranged. Then she left them there. She walked out of the attic, down through the house, and out the door. All she had to do was light the fire. The flames spread fast. Her husband woke up to smoke and heat. The house was burning. Panicked, he ran outside, coughing, calling out for his wife and children. He searched the yard, screaming their names, expecting them to come running out behind him, but they never did. He saw no sign of them anywhere. In the chaos, he assumed the only thing that made sense to his terrified mind. He believed his wife had taken the girls and escaped while he was still asleep. He believed they were safe somewhere, watching the fire from a distance. That belief was the only thing keeping him on his feet. The fire department arrived and worked to control the blaze. As the flames died down and the smoke cleared, firefighters began searching the remains of the house. That's when they found the attic. That's when they found the bodies of the girls. The truth hit him all at once. The realization shattered him completely. Witnesses said he collapsed. Others said he screamed until his voice gave out. The man who had already lost one wife and forgiven an unforgivable act had now lost everything. He was never the same after that night. Within a year, he was dead. The family never talks about how it happened. Some say it was illness. Others say grief consumed him. The details were never shared, only that he didn't last long after losing his daughters. The wife, meanwhile, disappeared for a time, but she was eventually caught. Authorities pieced together what had happened, and she was sent to a South Carolina penitentiary. That's where another disturbing truth came out. The name she had given him was fake. The identity she married under did not belong to a real person. No one ever learned who she truly was, where she came from, or what her life had been before she entered the family. She was never properly identified. She served the rest of her life in prison, isolated, unstable, and unchanged. She died there a few years ago. According to those who knew of her case, she went into that penitentiary insane. And she died the same way. No remorse, no explanation, no closure. For generations, this story was spoken about in hushed tones. Pieces of it were shared, but never all at once. Some details were avoided. Some questions were left unanswered, but the core of it remained, passed down as a warning and a reminder. Not every danger announces itself loudly. Not every monster looks like one. Sometimes the greatest threats enter quietly, marry into families, and are trusted when they should never be. And sometimes forgiveness costs everything. Amsterdam is a city that seems to pulse with a unique kind of energy, especially when the sun goes down and the neon lights begin to reflect off the dark. Still waters of the canals for a group of young women celebrating their final summer before the responsibilities of real life kicked in. It was the perfect playground. They had spent a week exploring the cobblestone streets, visiting world-class museums by day, and losing themselves in the legendary nightlife by night. It was a trip filled with laughter, shared secrets, and the kind of freedom that only comes when you are far away from home. By the time their last night arrived, they were exhausted, determined to go out with a bang. They had a plan that sounded perfect at the moment. They would stay out at the clubs until the early hours of the morning, and then head directly to the airport to catch their flight back home. It was a classic move for young travelers. a way to squeeze every last drop of excitement out of their vacation. The club they chose for their final night was one of those massive multi-story venues where the bass is so deep you can feel it in your chest, and the air is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fog machines. The music was a relentless hypnotic beat that made it easy to lose track of time. One of the girls, a bright and outgoing person who always seemed to attract attention, found herself standing at one of the long, polished bars, waiting for a drink. That was where she met him. He was a local, or at least he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew the city well. He was handsome in a subtle, understated way, with a smile that felt genuine in eyes. That seemed to focus entirely on her despite the chaos of the crowded room. They started talking, their voices straining to be heard over the music, and the conversation flowed with an unexpected ease. For the next couple of hours, they were inseparable. They danced in the middle of the crowded floor, oblivious to the people bumping into them, and retreated to quieter corners of the club to talk whenever the music became too loud. There was a spark between them, the kind of instant connection that happens on holiday when you feel like a different, more adventurous version of yourself. As the night began to wind down and the first hints of dawn started to threaten the darkness outside, the flirtation escalated. They shared a long, passionate kiss near the exit of the club, the kind of kiss that felt like it could lead to something more. The man leaned in and whispered an invitation, asking her if she wanted to come back to his apartment. Under different circumstances, she might have said yes. He was charming. The night had been magical, and she wasn't ready for the fun to end. However, the reality of her travel schedule pulled her back to earth. She looked at her watch and realized that her friends were already gathering their things and looking for a taxi to the airport. She explained to him that she simply didn't have the time, that her flight was leaving in just a few hours, and she couldn't risk missing it. He seemed disappointed, but remained polite, suggesting that they at least stay in touch. They pulled out their phones and exchanged Snapchats, a quick and digital way to tether their brief encounter to the real world. With a final wave and a lingering glance, she ran to join her friends, feeling a bit of a thrill from the encounter, but mostly focused on the long journey ahead. The flight back across the Atlantic was a blur of cramped seats and fitful sleep. And by the time she landed back in her home city, the memory of the mysterious man in Amsterdam felt like a beautiful, hazy dream. Life returned to its normal rhythm almost immediately. She unpacked her suitcase, shared photos of the trip on social media, and got back into her daily routine. But a few days after her return, she noticed something strange. It started as a small, itchy patch near the corner of her mouth. At first, she thought it was just a cold sore brought on by the stress of travel and the lack of sleep. She applied some over-the-counter cream and tried to ignore it. But instead of getting better, the irritation spread. Within 48 hours, a bright red, angry rash had developed all around her lips and even inside her mouth. It was painful, unsightly, and unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Panicked and confused, she made an appointment with her family doctor. The doctor was equally puzzled. He examined the rash closely, noting the unusual texture and the way it seemed to be reacting to the sensitive skin of her mouth. He admitted that he had never seen a viral or bacterial infection that looked quite like this. He decided the best course of action was to take a swab of the affected area and send it to a specialized lab for deep testing. He told her not to worry too much and that they would have the results in a few days. She went home and tried to stay positive, but the discomfort was constant, and a growing sense of dread began to settle in her stomach. She kept thinking back to her trip, wondering if she had eaten something strange or if the tap water in the hotel had been contaminated. A few days later, her phone rang. It was the doctor's office, but the tone of the receptionist was different than usual. There was a sense of urgency in her voice that made the girl's heart race. They told her she needed to come into the office immediately, that the results were back, and the doctor needed to speak with her in person. When she arrived at the clinic, she was surprised to see 2 police officers standing in the waiting room. Before she could even check in at the front desk, the officers approached her. They were professional but stern, asking her to confirm her identity. Without much explanation, they told her she needed to come with them to the local police station for questioning. She was absolutely terrified, her mind racing through every possible thing she could have done wrong, but she couldn't think of a single thing. At the station, she was led into a small, sterile interrogation room. The officers sat across from her, their expressions grim. They didn't start with questions about her trip or her health. Instead, they dropped a bombshell that left her speechless. They told her that the lab results from her mouth swab had come back with something deeply disturbing. The scientists had identified a very specific and rare type of bacteria in the sores around her mouth. This particular strain was not found in nature, nor was it a common human illness. It was a bacteria that was exclusively associated with the consumption of decomposing human flesh. The officers looked at her with a mixture of horror and suspicion, explaining that they were investigating her for potential involvement in cannibalism. They thought she had been eating people. The girl sat there in total shock, her head spinning. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. She started crying, trying to explain through her sobs that she was a normal person, a student, someone who loved animals and had never even been in a fight, let alone something as horrific as what they were suggesting. She told them she had just gotten back from a vacation in Amsterdam and had been sick ever since. The police were skeptical at first, but as she walked them through her trip day by day, they began to listen. She told them about the night at the club and the man she had met. She remembered the long, intense kiss and how he had invited her back to his place. She told them that the rash started only a few days after that encounter. As she spoke, she remembered the Snapchat she had exchanged with him. She pulled out her phone and showed the officers the man's profile. The name and the photos were still there. The local. Police immediately contacted the authorities in Amsterdam, passing along the information and the digital footprint she had provided. The Dutch police took the information seriously and launched an immediate undercover investigation into the man. It didn't take them long to find him. When they raided his apartment in a quiet neighborhood of the city, they discovered a scene that was straight out of a horror movie. The man was not just a charming local looking for a holiday romance. He was a calculated and deeply disturbed predator. The investigation revealed that the man had a history of luring young women, particularly tourists, who were unlikely to be missed immediately, back to his home. Once there, he would murder them, and in a gruesome twist that confirmed the lab results, he would consume parts of their bodies. He had been doing this for some time, and the police found evidence of several victims who had gone missing over the past year. The reason the girl had contracted the horrific bacteria was because the man had recently consumed human flesh before going to the club that night. When he kissed her, the bacteria from his mouth had transferred to hers, finding a way into her system through the small friction burns or tiny cuts that can happen during a long night of dancing and kissing. The girl was eventually cleared of all suspicion, but the psychological toll was immense. The realization of how close she had come to a gruesome death was something she couldn't shake, if she hadn't been worried about her flight. If she hadn't been so focused on getting to the airport on time, she would have walked right into his trap. Her responsibility to her friends and her schedule had quite literally saved her life. The man was arrested and faced life in prison for his unspeakable crimes. But for the girl, the world felt like a much darker place. The rash eventually healed with the right antibiotics, but the invisible scars remained. She often thought about that night at the bar, the music, and the way he had smiled at her. It was a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a handsome stranger in a crowded room offering a drink and a warm smile. Her story became a chilling legend among her circle of friends, and eventually made its way back to her roommate, who told it to others as a warning. It served as a stark lesson about the dangers that can hide in plain sight and the importance of intuition. The lucky escape she had was the narrowest of margins, a few minutes of time that stood between her and a fate too terrible to imagine. Amsterdam remained a beautiful city in her memories, but it was now forever tainted by the shadow of the man who almost made her his final victim. The experience changed the way she lived her life. She became more cautious, more aware of her surroundings, and less trusting of strangers, even in the most festive environments. She realized that the thrill of travel and the excitement of meeting new people came with a hidden set of risks that no one ever really talks about. Every time she looked in the mirror and saw the place where the rash had been, she was reminded of her survival. She was one of the few who had looked into the eyes of a monster and lived to tell the story. A survivor of a darkness that most people only encounter in movies. Her life went on. But the memory of that last night in Amsterdam stayed with her. A quiet, haunting reminder of the day she almost didn't come home. 3 years ago, during the height of a particularly warm summer, I managed to land a part-time job that I thought would be the perfect way to spend my break. I was hired as a tourist guide at an old mining museum located in a quiet, rugged part of the countryside. It was a place where history seemed to hang heavy in the air, and the stories of the men who had worked there centuries ago were preserved in the very walls of the earth. On my first day, I arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. My boss, a man who had spent most of his life working in and around these mines, was tasked with showing me the ropes. He wanted to give me a full, comprehensive tour of the entire facility, so that I would be ready to lead my own groups of tourists by the following week. The museum was divided into two very distinct sections: the surface exhibits and the underground experience. We spent the first few hours on the surface, where he showed me the old rusted machinery, the living quarters of the former miners, and the various tools that had been used to extract minerals from the deep earth. It was interesting enough, but the real heart of the museum lay beneath our feet. To access the underground portion, visitors had to be fully equipped for a different environment. He handed me a heavy yellow raincoat, a hard plastic helmet, and a high-powered flashlight. He explained that even in the middle of a heat wave, the temperature inside the mine stayed at a constant chilly level, and the dampness could soak through your clothes in minutes. We began our descent into the darkness. The underground tour was a 1.5 km journey through a mine that was over 400 years old. As we walked, the light from the entrance quickly faded, replaced by the dim, flickering glow of the electric lights strung along the ceiling of the tunnels. The air changed instantly. It became cool, earthy, and thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. My boss led the way, his footsteps echoing against the rocky floor. He pointed out different geological formations and explained how the tunnels had been carved out by hand long before modern technology existed. We were about halfway through the journey when we passed a specific exhibit that caught my eye. It was an old wooden chest reinforced with iron bands that had once been used as a storage unit for the miners' heavy tools. It sat in a small alcove, looking every bit its age. I distinctly remember looking at it as we walked by, noting how solid and heavy the lid appeared to be. It was shut tight, its surface covered in a thin layer of fine dust. Right after passing the chest, we approached a long, steep wooden staircase that led further down, into a lower level of the mine. The wood groaned under our weight as we descended, the sound amplified by the narrow walls of the shaft. When we reached the bottom, my boss stopped near a small metal box mounted on the wall. He explained that this was an emergency telephone system. Safety was the top priority, and since cell phone signals were non-existent this far underground, these phones were the only link to the surface. He told me there were 3 such phones. One at the entrance, one here in the middle, and one at the final stop of the tour. If a tourist were to get sick, injured, or simply too overwhelmed by the claustrophobia of the mine, these phones would reach the cashier at the surface immediately. To make sure I knew how to operate them and to test the line, he came up with a simple task. He asked me to walk back the way we had come, head toward the entrance phone, and give him a call. He wanted to stay at the middle station to ensure the connection was clear. I nodded, feeling a bit of pride in being given my first official responsibility. I turned around and began the walk back alone. Being by myself in the mine was a completely different experience than walking with my boss. Without his constant chatter, the silence of the tunnels was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water hitting a puddle. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough, hewn walls and the occasional spiderweb clinging to the timber supports. I reached the wooden staircase and began to climb. My breath was slightly heavy from the exertion, and the rhythmic sound of my boots on the wood was the only thing I could hear. As I reached the top step, and my head rose above the floor level of the upper tunnel, I looked toward the alcove where the tool chest was kept. My heart skipped a beat. Even from a distance, I could see that something was wrong. The heavy wooden lid, which had been firmly closed just minutes ago when we walked past it together, was now standing wide open. I froze in the middle of the staircase, my hand gripping the cold wooden railing. Stared at the open chest, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. I thought to myself that perhaps I had simply misremembered, or that the dim light had played a trick on my eyes. Maybe my boss had opened it while I wasn't looking. Or perhaps there was another staff member in the mine that I hadn't met yet. I tried to shake off the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. I forced myself to keep walking toward it, thinking that I should probably close it. Before I continued to the phone, as I got within a few feet of the chest, the unthinkable happened. Without a breath of wind, without a sound of footsteps, and without any visible cause, the heavy lid slammed shut with a violent force. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a massive wooden crack that echoed down the tunnels like a gunshot. I jumped back, a muffled scream escaping my throat. My heart began to race so fast I could feel the pulse in my neck. I stood there for a second, paralyzed by a raw primal fear. There was no one there. The tunnel was empty in both directions, and there was absolutely no reason for that lid to move on, its own, let alone slam shut with such aggression. I didn't wait around to investigate. I turned on my heel and ran back toward the stairs, practically flying down them until I reached the spot where my boss was waiting. I was pale and shaking, my chest heaving as I tried to find the words to explain what I had just seen. When I finally managed to gasp out the story about the chest, the expression on my boss's face changed. He didn't laugh and he didn't tell me I was being dramatic. Instead, he looked toward the stairs with a strange, hollow look in his eyes. He told me quite firmly that the chest is always kept closed because it is completely empty and there is no reason for anyone to ever open it. He could clearly see how terrified I was. He tried to stay professional and play it cool, but I noticed that he didn't suggest I go back to the phone. In fact, he decided to cut the rest of the tour short. He gathered his things and led me straight toward the exit, moving at a much faster pace than he had during our descent. He didn't say much as we navigated the final tunnels, and I kept my flashlight pointed strictly at his heels, too afraid to look back into the shadows behind us. Once we were back on the surface, and the warm summer sun hit our faces, the terror of the mine began to feel a bit more distant, but the memory was still vivid. We took off our raincoats and helmets, and my boss pulled me aside. He told me that while the mine is a quiet and often creepy place, when you were alone, neither he nor any of the other long-term employees had ever experienced anything quite like what I had just described. He said that some people claim to hear strange noises or feel a sense of being watched, but a physical manifestation like a slamming chest was unheard of in his years there. Despite his attempt to reassure me, I could tell he was unsettled. He had been through those tunnels thousands of times, and for something new and unexplainable to happen on my very first day felt like a bad omen. I spent the rest of my shift on the surface, helping with the ticket sales and organizing the gift shop. I couldn't bring myself to go back underground for the rest of the day. Every time I looked at the dark opening of the mine entrance, I thought about that heavy wooden lid and the force with which it had crashed down. As the weeks went by, I eventually got used to the mine. I led dozens of tours, and I always made sure to keep my groups close. Whenever we passed that old tool chest, I never saw it open again, and I never heard that slamming sound again. But the feeling of unease never truly left me. I often wondered if the mine itself was reacting to a new presence, or if some remnant of the past was still lingering in those 400-year-old tunnels, watching the new guides come and go. The job taught me a lot about history, but it taught me even more about the things we can't explain. There is a specific kind of silence that exists deep underground. A silence that feels alive. Even now, years later, when I think about that first day, I can still hear the echo of that chest slamming shut. It remains one of the most frightening moments of my life, a reminder that some places hold on to their secrets and their spirits long after the living have moved on. I finished my summer contract at the museum, but I was relieved when the season ended and I could leave the dark tunnels behind for good. Some stories are meant to be told, and some experiences are meant to stay buried. The deep, cold earth where they belong. When I was a very young child, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, I lived in a house that was unlike any other in our small town. It was an old train depot that had been converted into a family home. Because of its history, the building had a unique character with high ceilings, large windows, and a lingering sense of the thousands of travelers who must have passed through its doors when the tracks were still active. Living there felt like living inside a piece of history, right next to. Our home was another repurposed structure, a large old barn that had been turned into the town's main market. This store was the heart of our neighborhood, and it was run by a lovely Vietnamese couple who had become very close friends with my mother. They were kind, hardworking people, and my mother often spent time chatting with them while she did her grocery shopping. One particular evening, the air felt heavy and still as my mother, and I began our short walk from our front door to the market. It was a typical small town. Evening where you expect nothing but peace and quiet. But as we stepped outside, my mother stopped in her tracks. She crinkled her nose and looked around with a confused expression. There was a scent in the air that was hard to describe at first. It was thick, sweet in a sickly way, and incredibly putrid. It wasn't like the smell of a dead animal in the woods. It was much more intense and overwhelming. My mother didn't say much to me at first, likely trying to shield me from whatever it was, but she kept looking around the side of the old barn as we walked. When we stepped inside the market, the bell above the door chimed, and we saw the wife, a woman named me, standing behind the wooden counter. Before my mother even picked up a basket, she asked me if she had noticed the horrible smell lingering just outside the doors. Me sighed and leaned against the counter, looking exhausted. She told my mother that she had been smelling it all afternoon, and that it had been giving her a headache. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she pointed toward the back of the property. She mentioned that there was a strange car parked out back that had been sitting there in the same spot all day long. According to the smell was significantly worse whenever she went near that vehicle. My mother and the couple talked for a few more minutes, their voices dropping into hushed, serious tones. Eventually, the couple decided that they couldn't ignore it any longer. They picked up the phone and called the local police, asking them to come and check out the abandoned car and perhaps have it towed away. We stayed in the store for a while, and soon enough the quiet evening was interrupted by the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers. What started as a simple request for a tow quickly turned into something much more serious. The police officers didn't take long to realize that this wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. As they approached the car, they immediately covered their faces with their hands. I remember watching from a distance as they began to set up a yellow tape perimeter around the car and the back of the barn. In a small town like ours, news travels faster than the wind. Within 30 minutes, it seemed like almost everyone in town had stopped their cars or walked over from their houses to see what was happening. There was a crowd of people standing at the edge of the police line, whispering and staring at the car. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. When the officers finally forced open the trunk of that abandoned car, they found the body of a man who had been missing for some time. The summer heat had been relentless, and the trunk had acted like an oven. I don't know if I actually caught a glimpse of it myself, or if the description was so vivid from the adults talking later that it became a permanent image in my mind. But the detail that stuck with everyone was how the body looked. Because of the gases that build up during decomposition, the man's body had bloated to a terrifying degree. People described him as being blown up like a giant macabre balloon. It was a gruesome discovery for such a small, tight-knit community. And the image of that car and what was hidden inside stayed with me for years. It was the first time I realized that even in a place that feels safe, darkness can be parked right in your backyard. That wasn't the only time my hometown was touched by violence during those years. Not long after the incident at the market, another tragedy occurred. Just a few houses down the street from where we lived, it was a double homicide, the kind of thing you only read about in newspapers from big cities. The rumors around town were that it was a drug deal that had gone terribly wrong. A group of men had come to a duplex down the street to collect a debt or settle a score, and they weren't interested in talking. The violence was brutal and sudden. One of the men inside the house was killed with a gun. A quick and violent end, but the second victim met an even more horrific fate. He had tried to run, making it as far as the front yard, but he was chased down and killed with a heavy piece of lumber, a 2x4. During all this chaos, there was a woman inside the house who had managed to hide. She had scrambled into the laundry room and buried herself under a massive pile of dirty clothes, holding her breath and praying that the killers wouldn't find her. She stayed there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the struggle and the final heavy silence that followed. Once she thought it was finally safe to move, she burst the house and ran to the nearest neighbor's home. She was covered in dust and trembling with fear, banging on the front door and screaming for help. The house she ran to belonged to the pastor of one of our local churches. You would think that a man of God, someone dedicated to helping those in need, would have opened the docker immediately. But instead, the pastor ignored her. He heard her cries. He heard her desperate banging, and he chose to stay inside. He didn't even bother to pick up the phone to call 911. The poor woman had to run to another house further down the block before someone finally took her in and called the police. The town was outraged when they found out the pastor had turned his back on her. Many of the neighbors later claimed that they had heard the distinct sickening crack of the wood hitting the victim's head in the front yard. Because it was the dead of night in such a small town, the sound traveled clearly through the cold air. The silence of the night made the violence feel even louder. Sharp contrast to the peaceful life we were all supposed to be living. These two events happening so close to my home and so early in my life changed the way I saw the world. I lived in an old train depot, a place built for movement and adventure. But I learned that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that stay still, like a car in a parking lot or a neighbor who refuses to open his door. My mother continued to be friends with the Vietnamese couple at the market, but there was always a lingering sadness when we walked past the back of that barn. We no longer just saw an old building. We saw the place where a mystery had ended in the most horrific way possible. The small town atmosphere, which usually felt like a warm blanket, started to feel a bit thinner after those murders. People began to lock their doors more carefully, and the local pastor's church saw a lot of empty pews for a long time. It was a loss of innocence for all of us. I grew up understanding that human nature is a complex thing capable of great kindness like the couple at the store, but also capable of extreme cruelty and even worse indifference. I still think about that woman in the laundry room sometimes. I think about the courage it took for her to stay silent under those clothes, and the absolute betrayal she must have felt when the pastor's lights stayed off and his door stayed locked. It's a reminder that being a good person isn't about the title you hold or the clothes you wear. It's about what you do. When someone is screaming for help on your doorstep in the middle of the night. Living in that train depot gave me a unique perspective on life. I saw people coming and going, even if it was just in my imagination. But the real stories were the ones that happened right there on our street. The bloated man in the trunk and the sounds of that night down the street became part of the town's hidden history. They are the stories that aren't written in the official records, but are whispered by the locals who remember the smell of the air and the sound of the silence that follows a tragedy. My childhood was shaped by these moments of stark reality, teaching me that the world is a place of both light and shadow, and often they are separated by nothing more than a thin wooden door or a pile of laundry. As I got older and eventually moved away from that converted train depot, those memories followed me. They served as a foundation for understanding the importance of community and the devastating impact of its failure. The image of the Vietnamese couple, me and her husband, remains a bright spot in those dark stories. They were the ones who noticed something was wrong, who spoke up and who tried to keep their neighborhood safe. They represented the best of our town, while the events around them represented the worst. The train depot is probably still there, and the barn market might still be serving customers. But the town is different now. The people involved have moved on or passed away, but the echoes of those nights still linger for those of us who were there. It taught me to pay attention to the things that seem out of place. A strange car, a quiet neighbor, or a smell that shouldn't be there. It taught me that life is fragile and that our safety is often dependent on the choices of those around us. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to have a mother who kept me close and friends who looked out for one another, even when the world outside was turning into something we couldn't quite understand. The winter of 1945 was a time of quiet tension across the United States. While the battlefields of World War II were thousands of miles away across vast oceans, the sense of the conflict was felt in every small town, every ration card, and every family with a son or father overseas. In the tiny rural community of North Door, Michigan, life seemed to move at its own slow, snowy pace, far removed from the headlines of the global war. North Door was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest news of the week was usually related to the weather or the local crops. But on February 23rd, 1945, this small town unknowingly became a footnote in the history of international warfare, though it would take nearly 2 decades for the residents to understand exactly what had happened in their own backyard. It was a crisp, bright day. The kind of afternoon where the sun reflects off the fresh Michigan snow with a blinding intensity. The air was cold and biting, but for 3 young boys, it was the perfect weather for an adventure. Brothers Bob and Ken Fine, along with their best friend Larry Bailey, who everyone affectionately called Buzz, were outside playing near the Fine family home. At that age, their world was small, bounded by the frozen fields and the gravel roads that connected the local farms. They were preteens, full of energy and curiosity, oblivious to the fact that on the other side of the planet, a desperate military campaign was being launched that would eventually drift directly into their line of sight. As they played in the snow, their attention was suddenly pulled away from their games. One of them looked up toward the pale blue sky and saw something that didn't belong. It wasn't a bird, and it certainly wasn't one of the rare airplanes that occasionally buzzed over the rural landscape. It looked like a massive shimmering blob, a strange and ethereal shape floating high above the treetops. Buzz, who would later recall the moment with perfect clarity even as an 81-year-old man, remembered the sheer excitement that surged. Group, none of them had ever seen anything like it. It was about a half mile up in the air, caught in a gentle current, drifting downward at a steady 45 degrees angle. It looked graceful, silent, and mysterious. The boys watched, captivated, as the object continued its slow descent. They were certain it was going to land nearby, and the thought of discovering something so alien and unexpected was more than they could resist. Luck was on their side that day, as a family friend named Joe Wolf happened to be visiting the Fine house. Joe was an adult with a pickup truck, and when the boys frantically pointed out the descending object, he didn't dismiss their excitement. Instead, he offered to take them on a chase to see where the mysterious blob would eventually touch down. The boys scrambled into the back of the truck, their hearts pounding with anticipation as Joe pulled out of the driveway and headed east. They drove about a mile, the tires of the pickup crunching over the icy patches on the road. Joe turned right onto 21st Street, scanning the horizon for any sign of the object. It didn't take long to find it. About 50 yards off the road, resting quietly on the frozen farmland belonging to Basilstein, was the strange visitor from the sky. As they hopped out of the truck and trudged through the snow toward the site, the scale of the object became apparent. It wasn't a small toy or a weather instrument. It was enormous. Up close, they could see a massive envelope of material partially deflated and draped over the ground like a giant discarded parachute. Numerous long ropes were tangled around it, trailing off into the snow. Joe and the boys circled the object, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. Based on the sheer size of the balloon-like structure in the ropes, they naturally assumed it was some kind of large balloon. However, as they moved closer to the center of the mass, they noticed something much more peculiar. Attached to the ropes was a wooden platform. It wasn't just any platform. It was charred and blackened as if it had been subjected to intense heat or an explosion. To the boys, it just looked like a strange piece of debris, perhaps part of a scientific experiment gone wrong. They had no way of knowing that the scorched wood was the remains of a mechanism designed to carry deadly explosives across the Pacific Ocean. In the spirit of rural resourcefulness, Joe and the boys decided that such a find shouldn't be left out in the field. They didn't see any danger. They saw a trophy, a fascinating piece of junk that they wanted to examine more closely. Together, they grabbed hold of the heavy ropes and began to drag the massive object across the snow toward the road. It was a struggle, the material catching on the stubble of the harvested field, but they eventually managed to heave it into the bed of Joe's pickup truck. With the mysterious balloon safely loaded, they drove back to the Fine house, eager to show their discovery to the rest of the family. When they arrived, they realized the object was much larger than they had first thought. It was so big that they couldn't just leave it in the yard or the garage. They decided the best place for it was the basement. It took all of their collective strength to cram the massive billowing material through the back door and maneuver it down the narrow stairs. Once they got it into the basement, the balloon spread out, covering the floor from one end of the room to the other. It was a surreal sight, a piece of international mystery sitting right next to the family's laundry and winter supplies. Genevieve Fine, the mother of Bob and Ken, was less than thrilled about the giant charred object taking over her basement. She was a sensible woman, and the sight of the blackened platform and the sheer size of the balloon made her uneasy. In a small Catholic community like North Door, the first person you often turned to for guidance was the local priest. She called him immediately, and he came over to the house to inspect the find. He stood in the basement looking at the strange material in the burnt wood, and his instincts told him that this wasn't just a harmless weather balloon. He advised Genevieve to contact the authorities right away. Following the priest's advice, Genevieve called the Kent County Sheriff's Department. Within a short time, deputies arrived at the front door looking confused and a bit skeptical. They went down into the basement and stared at the massive object. Their initial thought was the same as the boys. It must be a weather balloon that had gone off course. They made a quick call to the local weather bureau, but the response they got only deepened the mystery. The bureau told them that there were no weather balloons in use that day, and that nothing of that size belonged to them. The deputies realized they were out of their depth and contacted the FBI. The balloon stayed in the Fine family basement overnight, a silent and chilling guest beneath their feet. The next morning, while Bob, Ken, and Buzz were at school, the quiet of the Fine farm was interrupted by the arrival of several black cars. Members of the federal government, including agents with a very serious demeanor, swarmed the house. They didn't spend much time talking to the locals. They moved with a sense of extreme urgency, quickly and efficiently confiscating the balloon and every piece of debris associated with it. Before they left, they sat the family down and gave them a very clear, very stern order. They were told never to speak of what they had found. They were instructed to go about their lives as if the balloon had never existed, and to forget that anything had ever fallen from the sky. For the three boys, the next 15 years were a time of silent wondering. They had followed the orders of the government, but they never stopped thinking about that day in the snow. They would occasionally talk among themselves, trying to piece together what it could have been. But without any information, it remained a strange childhood memory. It wasn't until 1960, when the United States government finally began to declassify information about the secret Japanese military campaigns of World War II, that the truth was revealed. They discovered that they hadn't found a weather balloon or a piece of trash. They had found a Fugo balloon bomb. The Fugo project was a desperate and ingenious plan by the Japanese military to strike the American mainland. They launched thousands of high-altitude balloons made of traditional washi paper or silk, filled with hydrogen, and equipped with a complex system of sandbags and sensors that allowed them to ride the jet stream across the ocean. These balloons were designed to carry both incendiary and high-explosive bombs with the goal of starting massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest and causing panic among the civilian population. While most of the balloons fell harmlessly into the ocean or landed in unpopulated areas, a few made it as far east as Michigan. When Buzz and the Fine brothers read the declassified reports, a cold realization washed over them. They thought back to that afternoon on Basilstein's farm when they had grabbed the ropes and dragged the charred platform through the snow. They realized that they had been incredibly lucky. The platform was charred because the incendiary devices had already detonated or malfunctioned before the balloon landed. If the high-explosive bombs had still been active, the simple act of dragging the object across the rough ground would have likely triggered a massive explosion. The three young boys and their friend Joe Wolf would have been killed instantly, and the story of the Michigan balloon bomb would have ended in a much more tragic way. The discovery that they had survived a brush with a deadly weapon of war was a sobering thought for the men. Buzz later reflected on how fortunate they were that the bomb had detonated somewhere else before they found it. Their childhood curiosity had nearly led them to their deaths, but instead, it had given them a front-row seat to one of the most unusual military operations in history. They finally understood why the government had been so quick to silence them. During the war, the U.S. government was terrified that if the Japanese knew the balloons were actually reaching the mainland, they would launch even more of them. By keeping the landings a secret, they hoped to convince the Japanese military that the project was a failure. The specific balloon found in North Door had a journey of its own after it left the Fine basement. It was sent to the Naval Technical Air Intelligence Center in Anacostia, near the District of Columbia, for a thorough laboratory evaluation. Military scientists wanted to understand the technology and the materials used by the Japanese. From there, it was shipped to a research center in New Jersey for further study. Eventually, it fell into the hands of an employee at the center named Don Picard. a member of the famous Pickard family known for their work in high-altitude ballooning and deep-sea exploration. The balloon, once a secret weapon of war, became a piece of scientific curiosity. The story of the North Door balloon bomb remains a fascinating chapter in Michigan's history. It is a reminder that even the most remote corners of the world are never truly isolated from the events of the wider world. To the people of that small rural town, February 23rd, 1945, started as just another cold winter day. But for 3 boys, it was the day the war literally landed at their feet. They went from being typical children playing in the snow to being the keepers of a military secret that would take a lifetime to fully understand. Today, the fields of North Door are still quiet and peaceful, and the fine farm looks much like any other homestead in that part of the country. But for those who know the story, the landscape holds a different meaning. It is a place where a silent traveler from across the sea once came to rest, bringing with it the shadows of a global conflict and a mystery that stayed buried in a basement and in the memories of 3 friends for decades. It serves as a haunting lesson that sometimes the things we find in the quiet moments of our lives are part of a much larger, much more dangerous story than we could ever imagine. The survival of Buzz and the Fine brothers is a testament to the strange ways that fate works. They live to tell the tale, becoming living links to a secret history that was almost lost to time. Their story is now shared with a sense of wonder and relief, a narrative of a lucky escape that defined their youth and gave them a unique perspective on the way world. It is a story of a small town, a big secret, and a mysterious blob in the sky that turned a snowy afternoon into an unforgettable brush with history. I spent my early childhood years in a place that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel rather than a setting for young children. My kindergarten was located in a massive, crumbling mansion just a few hundred meters from where I lived in Italy. It was an old, beautiful villa that had once belonged to a noble family who had long since been forgotten by history. Much like many of the other grand estates in that particular region, there was a small, unassuming tag hanging. Near the main gate that read Villa Giosa. In Italian, that name translates to joyful villa, but there was something about the atmosphere of the place that felt anything but joyful. The exterior was surrounded by a wild, unkempt garden where the weeds grew tall, and the vines seemed to be slowly reclaiming the stone walls. In the middle of this overgrown yard sat an old stone well. It had been sealed shut with a heavy metal hatch, and as children we were always told to stay far away from it. I don't exactly remember the first time I heard the dark history of the mansion. It was likely when I was a bit older, perhaps in elementary school, when the local kids started whispering about the secrets of the building next door. The story was well known among the adults in the area, passed down through generations like a grim piece of folklore. It dated back to the beginning of the 20th century, a time when life in southern Italy was incredibly difficult. Poverty was widespread, and many people were desperate to find a better life. Elsewhere, waves of men and women were leaving their small villages to catch ships headed for the United States or Australia. It was a time of both great hope and deep sorrow, as families were torn apart by the need for survival. During this era, many men would leave their wives and children behind, promising to send money back as soon as they found work in the factories or mines of the New World. However, there were also those who had no one at all. These were the lonely individuals, the ones who had no family to miss them and no friends to write to. They were the perfect targets for anyone looking to exploit the vulnerable. Because most of these people were poor and unable to read or write, they couldn't navigate the complicated process of moving overseas on their own. They relied entirely on travel agencies to handle the purchase of their tickets and to organize their passage across the Mediterranean and then the vast Atlantic Ocean. The people of our town were thrilled when a new travel agency opened its doors right inside that old villa. It seemed like a blessing. For a while, the business appeared to be running smoothly. Villagers would watch as neighbors hugged their loved ones goodbye, waved a final farewell to the local shopkeepers, and set off toward the villa to finalize their paperwork and catch a ride to the harbor. Since nobody in our small town owned a car back then, the agency offered a special luxury. They would provide a private lift to the port in Naples for anyone who bought a ticket. to a poor laborer who had spent his whole life walking or riding a donkey. The idea of a car ride to the city felt like the height of sophistication and safety. The agents working out of the villa were very clever. They would identify people who had no strong connections to the community. Travelers who didn't have anyone waiting for them or anyone to report them missing if they didn't arrive at their destination. These unsuspecting people were instructed to sell everything they owned and bring all their cash with them when they came to collect their final travel documents. They were told that having all their wealth in their pocket would make their start in America much easier. One by one, these lonely travelers would enter the Vilyasa, expecting to start a new life. But many of them were never seen or heard from again. The truth only came to light because of one man's incredible luck, or perhaps a moment of divine intervention. There are different versions of how he survived. Some locals say he was sitting in the agent's office when he saw a strange shadow in the reflection of the polished desk or a nearby window. Others say he felt a sudden chill and turned his head just as a heavy hammer was swinging toward his skull. The blow didn't land squarely, failing to crush his head as intended. Despite the shock and the pain, the man realized instantly that he was being murdered for his money. He fought back with the strength of a man who knew his life depended on it, managed to scramble out of the office, and ran out of the villa as fast as his legs would carry him. He didn't stop until he reached the authorities and told them exactly what had happened inside the joyful villa. When the police arrived and raided the mansion, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The travel agents were nothing more than cold-blooded killers who had been systematic in their predation. The investigation led the officers to the garden, to that very same well I used to play near as a child. When they pried open the top, the smell was said to be unbearable. They discovered that the bottom of the well was filled with human remains. To make matters even more grisly, the killers had been using strong acid to dissolve the bodies of their victims, hoping to destroy any evidence that could link them to the disappearances. They had been stripping these poor people of their life savings and then disposing of them in the dark, damp hole in the ground. The discovery sent a shock wave through the entire region. The news of the travel agency of death was the only thing people talked about for years. Although I tried to find old newspapers. From that period when I got older, I couldn't find any official written records. It's possible that during the chaos of the early 1900s, such local tragedies weren't always documented in the way we expect today, or perhaps the records were lost during the wars. But in our town, the history was kept alive through word of mouth. For decades after the arrests, the building was never referred to as Villa Giosa. Everyone in the area unofficially called it Villa de la Morte, the Villa of Death. It stood, empty for a long time, a dark stain on the landscape that no one wanted to go near. Eventually, the memory began to fade just enough for the building to be repurposed. The town needed a school, and the old mansion, despite its history, was a large and sturdy structure. It was renovated. The wild garden was trimmed back, and the name Vilyasa was reinstated to give it a sense of fresh, happy beginnings. It was turned into the kindergarten where I spent my days as a young child. They put a metal hatch over the well and told us it was for safety, never mentioning that it was actually a tomb for an unknown number of people who had been seeking a better life, but found only a dark end. I often think back to my time there, remembering how we would run around the yard playing games and laughing just a few feet away from that sealed well. There is a strange, unsettling irony in the fact that a place where so much life was stolen eventually became a place filled with the sounds of children. We were the joyful ones, the name promised, but we were playing on top of a history that was purely macabre. I still don't know exactly how many people died in that villa. The secrets of how many souls were lost to the acid and the darkness of the well are buried along with the names of the victims. It makes me realize how layers of history are built on top of one another. We walk through buildings and parks every day without knowing the weight of what happened there before we arrived. To me, it was just a school with a big garden. But to a whole generation of people in my town, it was a place of nightmare. Even though the villa now serves a good purpose, that metal hatch on the well remains a silent witness to the greed and cruelty of the men who once called themselves travel agents. It is a chilling thought that the very ground where I learned my first lessons was once a site of such calculated evil. I sometimes wonder if the teachers knew. They must have. They were locals, too. I imagine them watching us play, hoping that our laughter would somehow wash away the echoes of the past. But some things can't be washed away. The nickname Villa de la Morte might have been replaced on the gate, but it stayed in the hearts of the elders who remembered the truth. It serves as a reminder that the world is full of hidden stories, and sometimes the most peaceful-looking places are the ones with the darkest shadows. My childhood in that mansion was happy, but knowing what I know now, I can't help but feel a lingering sense of dread whenever I think of that sealed well in the unkempt garden. My freshman year of college is something I usually remember in pieces. New independence, long hallways that all look the same, late nights, and the strange mix of excitement and exhaustion that comes with living in a dorm for the first time. At the time, nothing about that year felt especially dark or dangerous. If anything, it felt routine. Looking back now, that's what makes this story so unsettling. What happened didn't announce itself with screams or alarms. It crept in slowly, quietly through something as simple and easy to ignore as a smell. I lived on campus in one of the older dorm buildings. It was tall, narrow, and built in a way that made every floor feel like a long tunnel. The second floor was where I spent most of my time. My boyfriend lived at the very end of the hall, so every day I walked the full length of it to see him. It became a habit. I could probably have walked that hallway blindfolded. I knew where the lights flickered slightly, where the carpet dipped, which doors slammed louder than others. It was familiar and safe, or at least I thought it was. One afternoon, while walking down the hall like I had done countless times before, I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but distinct enough that it made me wrinkle my nose. It wasn't the usual dorm smells like old food trash or mildew. This was different. It was sharp and metallic, almost coppery. At the time, I couldn't quite place it, and because it wasn't overwhelming, I ignored it and kept walking. Over the next few days, I noticed it again and again, always in the same spot. About 3 or 4 rooms down from my boyfriend's room, the smell lingered in the air. It didn't move. It didn't fade. It just hovered there as if it belonged to that specific section of the hallway. Each time I passed through, it seemed a little stronger. Still, I told myself it had to be something harmless. Maybe a spill. Maybe someone hadn't taken their trash out. Dorms were full of weird smells, and no one ever questioned them too deeply. By the end of that first week, the smell was impossible to ignore. It had grown heavier, thicker, almost sticky in the back of my throat. It made my stomach turn slightly if I breathed too deeply. I started pointing it out to my boyfriend, and soon it became a running joke between us. Every time we walked past that area of the hall, one of us would comment on it. We'd laugh and exaggerate how gross it was, covering our noses and making dramatic faces. Humor was easier than discomfort, and neither of us seriously considered that. Something was actually wrong. As the days went on, the smell didn't just stay the same. It intensified. It seeped into the carpet, into the walls, into the air itself. It was no longer something you noticed only if you paid attention. It hit you the moment you reached that part of the hall. Other students started commenting on it too. Some complained to each other, some shrugged it off, and some joked about a dead animal in the vents. No one seemed alarmed enough to report it. About a week and a half after I first noticed the smell, everything changed. One morning, the hallway was chaotic in a way I had never seen before. Maintenance workers were moving quickly, hauling equipment, talking in low, urgent voices. Water had started flooding the area directly beneath that room. The ceiling below was dripping steadily, and parts of the hallway floor were wet. People were standing around whispering, confused and annoyed, wondering how something like that could happen. At first, I assumed it was just a plumbing issue. Old buildings have problems, pipes burst, toilets overflow. It was inconvenient, but nothing more. That's what I thought until I saw the expressions on the faces of the maintenance workers when they came out of that room. They didn't look annoyed or frustrated. They looked shaken. Word spread quickly, as it always does in dorms, even when administrators try to keep things quiet. Someone overheard something they weren't supposed to. Someone else saw something through a partially open door. The details trickled out slowly at first, distorted and incomplete, but horrifying, even in fragments. The single occupant of that room had been capturing small animals. No one knew exactly how long it had been happening. Days, maybe weeks. He had been trapping small animals, killing them inside the dorm room, and using their blood to write messages on the walls and bathroom mirror. The writing wasn't random scribbles. It was deliberate, Repeated, obsessive words and symbols referencing evil and Satan scrolled in dark, drying streaks that had soaked into the paint and glass. The smell suddenly made sense in the most awful way possible. After killing the animals, he attempted to flush their carcasses down the toilet over and over again. That's what caused the flooding. The plumbing couldn't handle it, and eventually it backed up and burst, sending water and filth down into the floor below. That failure was the only reason anyone discovered what was happening in that room. When maintenance walked in, they weren't prepared for what they found. The room wasn't just messy or dirty, it was something else entirely. The walls, the mirror, the bathroom, everything had been altered, stained, turned into something grotesque. The air inside was thick and overwhelming. It wasn't just the smell of decay. It was the smell of blood, metal, rot, and something deeply wrong. Campus police were called immediately. The student was removed from the dorm and taken to a psychiatric hospital. After that, the school moved fast. Too fast. Within days, the room was sealed off. It was fumigated, stripped, and completely redone. New carpet, new walls, new fixtures. It was as if they were trying to erase the fact that it had ever happened at all. Administrators sent out vague emails about a maintenance issue and reassured students that there was no danger. They didn't mention animals. They didn't mention blood. They didn't mention the writing. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. Unofficially, everyone knew something terrible had taken place. One student managed to get photos and video. Before everything was cleaned up, no one knows exactly how. Maybe they were friends with someone on the maintenance crew. Maybe they were just in the right place at the wrong time. Those images started to circulate quietly, passed from phone to phone in hushed conversations. I never saw them myself, but I heard enough descriptions to know I didn't want to. The administration found out quickly. That student was cornered, pressured, and forced to delete everything. The images vanished as if they had never existed. Anyone who talked too openly about what happened was warned to stop spreading rumors. The message was clear. Forget this. Move on. But it wasn't that easy. The room number became a whispered detail. Room 213. People avoided walking past it, even after it was reopened. Some students refused to live near it. Others claimed the smell never fully went away, that on certain days, if the air was right, you could still catch a faint trace of copper lingering in the hallway. I walked past that door countless times. After everything happened, every time I felt a tightening in my chest. The hallway looked the same. The carpet was clean. The walls were freshly painted. But knowing what had happened there changed everything. It was impossible to look at it as just another dorm room. What unsettled me most wasn't just the act itself. Horrific as it was how easily it went unnoticed. How something so disturbing could exist right next to normal college life. Students studying, laughing, living their lives, completely unaware that few doors down, something deeply wrong was unfolding behind a closed door. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about it. The smell I ignored, the jokes we made, the way the school tried to erase it all. Sometimes I think about how close we all were to something truly dangerous, and how it was only discovered because a toilet backed up at the wrong moment. Whenever I smell something metallic or coppery, now my mind goes right back to that hallway, to room 213, to the idea that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just lingers in the air waiting for someone to notice. June 4th, 1629, just before dawn, off the remote coast of what is now Western Australia, a massive Dutch ship named the Batavia struck a coral reef with a violent jolt. The sound of wood tearing apart echoed across the dark water. Panic spread instantly. The Batavia was no ordinary ship. It belonged to the Dutch East India Trading Company, the richest company in human history when adjusted for inflation. The vessel was carrying around 350 people and was supposed to be on a long journey to Jakarta, Indonesia, which was then known as Batavia as well. Instead, it became the site of one of the most horrifying survival stories ever recorded. As the ship broke apart, chaos ruled the decks. Passengers screamed. Crew members shouted conflicting orders and waves slammed against the hull. Many people were thrown into the sea without warning. In the confusion and darkness, about 40 people drowned almost immediately. Those who survived clung to floating debris, or swam desperately toward a small strip of land visible in the distance. That land was Beacon Island, a barren, low-lying island surrounded by reefs and shallow water. Around 300 people managed to reach Beacon Island alive. At the time, it felt like a miracle. They believed they had reached safety. But in truth, what waited for them there was far worse than the storm or the sea. Looking back, the 40 who drowned may have been the lucky ones. Beacon Island had almost no fresh water. Very little food and no shelter from the harsh sun. The survivors were exhausted, injured, and terrified. Supplies that washed ashore were limited and disorganized. Leadership quickly became a problem. The ship's captain, Francisco Pellert, knew immediately that help was not coming anytime soon. The Batavia had wrecked far from common shipping routes. If no one went for help, everyone on the island would eventually die. Captain Pelsart made a decision that would later be seen as both heroic and tragic. He gathered a small group of men and took a longboat that had survived the wreck. His plan was to sail north to Jakarta to get help. At the time, he had no idea how far the journey truly was. The distance was around 2,638 km or 1,639 mi across open ocean. No modern navigation tools, no certainty of land, just waves, wind, and luck. Against all odds, Pellert survived. For 33 days, the small boat battled storms, heat, hunger, and thirst. Many believed the journey was impossible, but he reached Jakarta alive. It took another 3 months to organize a rescue mission and return to Beacon Island. During those months, everything fell apart. When Pellert finally returned, he expected to find hungry but hopeful survivors. Instead, he discovered a nightmare. More than 100 people were dead, not from starvation or exposure, but from murder. Men, women, and even children had been brutally killed. Some women were being held prisoner, forced into what were essentially rape camps on the islands nearby. They were kept alive not as people, but as property. Later, testimony revealed chilling details. The men in power said they did not need 25 women. They selected 5 who were kept as women of common service. In simple terms, they were sexual slaves. The rest were discarded, killed, or left to die. The man responsible for turning survival into horror was Jeronimus Cornelis. Cornelis was a senior merchant aboard the Batavia, not a sailor, but a man with influence. Before the shipwreck, he had already been planning a mutiny. He held radical beliefs, resented authority, and believed he was smarter and more deserving than those above him. The shipwreck did not create his cruelty. It gave him the opportunity to unleash it. When Captain Pelsart left the island, he placed Cornelis in charge, believing him to be capable and trustworthy. That decision would cost over 100 lives. Once in power, Cornelis moved quickly. He gathered a group of loyal followers, men who either shared his views or were too afraid to oppose him. His first goal was control. To achieve that, he needed to eliminate anyone who could challenge him. Strong men, outspoken crew members, soldiers, and anyone who questioned his authority were targeted first. At first, the killings were disguised as accidents or necessary decisions. People were sent on dangerous errands and never returned. Others were accused of stealing food or causing trouble and were executed as examples. Over time, the violence became more open and more cruel. The weak were next. The sick, the elderly, women with children, and anyone seen as a burden on supplies were killed. Bobbies were drowned or strangled. Cornelis himself was said to have strangled one baby to death with his own hands. Most of the killings, however, were carried out by his followers under his direct orders. The island became a place of terror. People slept in fear, knowing that a wrong look or word could mean death. Trust vanished. Survival was no longer about food or water. It was about avoiding attention. Some survivors were sent to nearby islands under the excuse of searching for water. In reality, Cornelis believed they would die. What he did not know was that those people found fresh water and managed to arm themselves. They organized quietly, waiting for the right moment. By the time Captain Pelsart returned, the balance of power had begun to shift. Cornelis and his followers were no longer untouchable. When Pellert learned what had happened, he acted immediately. Cornelis was arrested and put on trial right there on the islands. The details of the trial revealed the full scale of the horror. Around 120 murders had been committed under Cornelis's rule. The crimes were described as savage, unnecessary, and driven by power rather than survival. Witnesses spoke of drownings, stabbings, beatings, and executions carried out without mercy. Cornelis showed little remorse. He tried to justify his actions, claiming they were necessary for survival and order. The court did not agree. His sentence was severe. Before he was executed, his hands were chiseled off as punishment for his crimes. After that, he was hanged. Several of his followers were also executed or left behind on the Australian mainland as punishment, a fate that likely meant death. When the final rescue was complete, only about 80 people survived the entire ordeal. Out of 350 who had set sail on the Batavia, more than 3/4 were dead. Some died to the sea, but most died at the hands of other humans. The story of the Bavia is not just a shipwreck story. It is a story about what happens when authority collapses, when power is given to the wrong person, and when fear replaces. Morality on a small island surrounded by endless ocean. Civilization disappeared frighteningly fast. What remained was raw human behavior stripped of law, structure, and compassion. Even today, the Batavia stands as one of the darkest survival stories in history. Not because nature was cruel, but because people were. My grandmother was what people usually call sensitive, although I've never really liked that word because it feels vague and incomplete. It doesn't fully explain what she was like. Still, it's the closest description I have. You could be having the worst day of your life, completely overwhelmed or quietly falling apart, and she would call you out of nowhere. She'd say she had a feeling you needed to talk. It wasn't dramatic or mystical. She never claimed special powers or made a show of it. She just knew. Distance didn't seem to matter. She could be busy, distracted, doing her own thing, and still somehow feel when someone she loved was in distress. It happened too often to be coincidence. At the same time, she avoided anything overtly paranormal. She hated ghost stories. She wouldn't watch horror movies. And while she was deeply spiritual, she refused to talk about her personal beliefs. If you asked her directly what she believed, she would gently change the subject. It was as if speaking about it openly made it weaker or dangerous. I think I inherited whatever it was she had. That's the part that's hardest to explain and even harder to say out loud without feeling. Ridiculous. My entire life, I've just known things, not facts, not information, feelings, states, presences. When I tried to explain it to my wife recently, the closest analogy I could come up with was that it's like a smell, but instead of using your nose, you feel it with your skin. An awareness that wraps around you. A certainty that doesn't come from thought. Like my grandmother, I know what people are really feeling, even when they don't say it, even when they're trying to hide it. It's not something I consciously analyze. I just know, and beyond people, I've always been able to sense something else. I don't have a good word for it. I don't know what it is. During my freshman year of college, I spent a full year ghost hunting. Not because I believed in ghosts, but because I wanted answers. I wanted to understand what I was sensing. I wanted a framework that made sense. I never found one. I don't believe in ghosts, at least not in the way they're usually described. But I do. Believe there are things we don't understand, things we don't have language for yet. Growing up, we lived in an old townhouse that sat on land once owned by a man named Lee Masters in Carroll County, Maryland. You can look him up if you want. He was a genuinely monstrous person. He owned a huge amount of land and ruled it like a tyrant. He enslaved people, raped them, and when enslaved women became pregnant, he burned them alive in a limestone furnace on his property. That furnace wasn't just a story. I helped work on the archaeological dig that eventually uncovered it. Bones were found, burned remains, physical proof that the stories were true. That kind of history doesn't feel distant when you're standing on the land it happened on, holding evidence in your hands. From the time I was very small, I hated that house. Some of that can easily be explained. My parents were going through an extremely rough and violent divorce. The atmosphere at home was tense and unpredictable. That alone can make any place feel unsafe. But what I felt went beyond that. I hated being alone in that house in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't just fear of the dark. It wasn't imagination running wild. I could feel something with me all the time. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't neutral. It felt like a dark presence that lingered in the corners of rooms watching. The feeling was strongest in the basement and in my bedroom. Those spaces felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. No matter what I was doing, no matter how distracted I tried to be, I could sense it nearby. For a long time, I told myself it was just childish fear. Kids get scared. Kids imagine things, that's normal. I tried to rationalize it that way, and for a while that explanation was enough. Then my brother was born. He isn't sensitive, not like me, not like my grandmother. He's practical, grounded, and skeptical. But even he felt it. We both heard things at night. Footsteps in the hallway, when no one was. There, scratching at our bedroom door, heavy breathing on the other side. I also started having the same recurring dream every single night. I would walk to the top of the basement stairs, jump down into the darkness, land at the bottom, climb back up, and do it again. Over and over, down into the dark, up again, down again. The dream was vivid and exhausting, and it happened so often that I started losing sleep. I've never been able to confirm whether I actually sleepwalked, and did this in real life. My parents don't remember it happening, but I have been known to sleepwalk on occasion. What makes me doubt it was real is that those basement stairs were tall and steep, and I was never injured. Still, the repetition of that dream felt purposeful in a way I can't explain. As I got older, things escalated. Lights would turn on and off by themselves. The television would suddenly cut out for no reason, then turn back on when we stood up to check it. Doors opened and closed on their own. I began seeing shadows, moving out of the corner of my eye constantly, not tricks of light, defined movement. Things would go missing and reappear months later in places we'd already searched as if they had never been gone. At night, I started feeling like something wanted to physically harm me, not just scare me, hurt me. That sensation of threat became overwhelming at times. On one occasion, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, I had what I believe was a seizure. I don't remember all the details clearly, but I remember waking up confused and terrified afterward. I didn't talk about any of this. Not with my parents, not with teachers, not with friends. The only person I spoke to was my brother. Eventually, even he told me to stop talking about it. He didn't want to hear it anymore, so I kept it to myself. We eventually moved, but not because of any of this. The move was for unrelated reasons. What I noticed, though, was that the farther we got from the original property, the less intense everything became. Our new house was across the city, still technically on land once owned by Lee Masters, but not part of his main living property. For a while, some of the same things happened. Lights flickering, odd sensations, but it didn't feel as heavy. That constant oppressive presence wasn't there anymore. It was like moving away from the center of something toxic. Sometimes these things happened in front of other people. Once a friend and I were playing Age of Mythology in the basement when we both saw a shadow figure move across the wall. I've never seen someone go pale that fast. He didn't come back to my house for a very long time after that. Over time, the activity faded. As I moved farther away from the master's estate, it almost disappeared entirely. I pushed it out of my mind. I'm a rational person. I believe in logic and science. Writing all of this down still makes me feel unhinged, like I sound insane just putting it into words. So I let it go. Occasionally, my brother would mention that things stopped happening after I moved out, but mostly we didn't talk about it. Recently, I took a job as a property manager. The apartment I now live in comes with the job. The woman who held the position before me died in this apartment from an opioid overdose. She was here for 3 days before she was found. Her dog survived by eating her face. When we moved in, I felt it again. Not the same presence from my childhood, but something familiar, something watching, something lingering. It wasn't as heavy, but it was there. I told myself to ignore it. I'd learned that paying attention only seemed to make things worse. Besides, the woman had died suddenly and violently. If anything was lingering, maybe it was just unresolved energy, something fatting. My wife spoke to her. She did it on her own without telling me beforehand. She thanked her for the apartment and told her it was okay to move on. When I found out, I didn't know what to say. I love my wife deeply, but if she had come to me first and said she felt someone was here, would I have believed her? I don't know. Since then, the sensation has grown stronger. I can't see the woman directly, but I know when she's in the room. I get that same skinned awareness, that smell without smell sensation. I know what she looks like even though I've never met her. She doesn't interact. She just watches. It became so physically overwhelming that I had to tell my wife. I hadn't felt anything like this since I was a child. And even then, I convinced myself it was imagination. This time felt different. When I told her, she told me something I didn't know. The day she spoke to the woman, our dog started sniffing around obsessively. Eventually, she dug out a plastic bag from under the heater. Inside were bloody gauze pads, likely from the previous tenant who injected heroin. Gauze she probably used to stop the bleeding. My wife also admitted that she had been feeling like someone was around too, which was why she spoke to the woman in the first place. Since then, we've ignored it. But I can't ignore what I feel. I think I have what my grandmother had, but I don't know what to call it. I don't know how to explain it. And that uncertainty scares me more than the sensations themselves. Sometimes I wonder if consciousness is a natural phenomenon like radio waves, and our bodies are just antennas tuned to certain frequencies for a while. Maybe her frequency is still vibrating here. Maybe I have some genetic trait that gives me broader perception, some sensitivity to dimensions we don't fully understand. And why does it always seem tied to places where terrible things happened? Why not places filled with joy? Why not love? I never sense anything from those places unless the emotion was overwhelming enough that almost anyone would feel it. I know how this sounds. Writing it out makes me feel exposed and foolish. But if you can't unload your insanity onto the internet, where can you? All jokes aside, if anyone has experienced anything like this, I would genuinely like to hear from you. Not because I want validation, but because not having a name or explanation for what's happening leaves me afraid. And fear, when you don't understand its source, has a way of sinking into your skin and staying there. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Night Fright.